All right, so today we're diving into something pretty mind-bending, and that is the mind-brain identity theory.
It is a fascinating one.
Yeah, and since you're a philosopher yourself,
Yes,
we can kind of jump right into the deep end here
absolutely.
and kind of skip over Philosophy 101.
Yes, let's dive right in.
So,
This theory states that
Mhm.
everything you consider mental,
okay.
all of your thoughts, emotions, that aha moment you get when you're working on a problem or something like that,
Yeah?
are literally identical with physical states of your brain.
Okay.
Not just caused by them, but are those brain states.
So, let me just try to wrap my head around this.
Sure.
If I were to stub my toe and I get that really sharp pain,
Yeah.
the identity theory is saying that it's not like the injury sends signals to my brain, which then creates pain. It's saying that pain just is the activity of certain neurons firing.
Precisely.
Okay.
It's a very radical shift in how we normally think about the mind
Yeah.
as this ethereal thing floating above it all.
Right.
Instead, mental states are just physical happenings.
Okay.
They're just like a bolt of lightning is just an electrical discharge.
So it's not about like a separate mind having pain. It's about a particular brain process that we've just labeled as pain because of how it feels to us.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the key insights here.
Yeah, I see the appeal of that, like the
Mhm.
elegance of that. But
Yes.
where I get tripped up is, isn't there something fundamentally different between the subjective feeling of pain and just neurons firing?
Yeah.
You know, can physical stuff really encompass that whole richness of our inner world?
That is the million-dollar question, and where I think things get really interesting, right?
Okay.
It's the problem of phenomenal properties or qualia that what it's like aspect of experience.
Right. How can we say, like, the redness I experience when I'm looking at an apple is just some neurons firing?
So one of the main ways the identity theory tries to answer this question is by appealing to what are called topic neutral properties. So for example, imagine a yellow afterimage.
Okay.
There is no actual yellow thing in your brain, but we still describe the experience as like seeing something yellow.
So we're finding a description that kind of avoids saying it's either purely mental or purely physical.
Exactly.
Okay.
You know, the experience has properties describable from both perspectives.
Okay, see.
Without committing to either side. So
Yeah.
it's like finding this common language for these seemingly disparate realms.
Okay, that's a cool way of thinking about it.
Yeah.
But then here's another thing that I get kind of hung up on with this.
Yeah.
How can I be wrong about feeling pain?
Yeah.
But scientists can misinterpret brain scans?
Yeah.
Like, if they're the same thing, shouldn't that certainty kind of transfer over?
Right. That's an excellent point. And that's something that the theory needs to grapple with. And the way that it tries to deal with that is by noting that sensation reports are lower claims or lower level claims, right? So saying it looks like X is different from claiming X is the case.
Okay.
When we're talking about sensations, we're simply reporting our experience, not making a claim about the objective world.
So it's more like, it looks like pain to me, which, yeah, okay.
Exactly.
The harder claim to be wrong about.
Exactly.
All right, cool, I'm following you.
Okay.
But let's not shy away from the elephant in the room here.
Yes. Yeah.
How does a purely physical system give rise to consciousness?
Yes.
Like, how does it give rise to that sense of me-ness, that there's an I that is experiencing this?
That is the core challenge for the identity theory.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
that seems like the biggest leap.
Yes, and I think, one of the first things we need to do in order to start addressing that question is to sort of distinguish between awareness on the one hand, which is just the automatic processing of information,
Okay.
versus consciousness, which is that subjective experience.
So my brain processing visual input is awareness, but the actual experience of seeing, of the world appearing to me, that's consciousness.
Precisely.
Okay, all right.
And so one of the main figures in the identity theory, a philosopher named D.M. Armstrong, he likened consciousness to proprioception, which is our sense of body position, right?
Right.
So just as I know that my arm is raised without having to look at it, my brain knows its own state.
Okay.
And that's what gives rise to the me experiencing it.
So my brain is aware of itself, and that's the me.
That's the general idea.
It's an interesting idea.
Yeah.
I'll give them that.
Yep.
But it still feels like there's more to it, you know?
Yeah.
Like my conscious experience is more than my brain just being aware of itself.
Right. And you're right to push on that because that is one of the places where I think the identity theory faces some serious challenges, and it's an ongoing
Yeah.
area of a debate. Another key thinker in this area was U.T. Place. And he had his own sort of model for how this might work, and he suggested that maybe what we have is what he called a zombie within.
A zombie within.
Yes. So a system that handles all of these tasks automatically without consciousness.
Right.
And consciousness only kicks in when there are problems or new situations
Okay.
that demand more processing power.
So my zombie within is like, handling walking while I'm daydreaming.
Exactly.
And then if I trip, I'm suddenly very conscious.
Exactly.
Okay, I kind of like that analogy.
Yeah.
But surely other thinkers have raised some issues with this whole framework, right?
No, absolutely.
Yeah.
The identity theory has its critics,
Yeah.
and these criticisms have forced really productive revisions, refinements.
Okay.
But I think we'll save those critiques
Yeah.
and how the theories had to change and adapt in response to those for our next segment.
That's good.
Yeah. So now I think we should turn our attention to some of the most potent critiques of the mind-brain identity theory.
Yeah, I imagine there's been a lot of pushback.
As you might expect, when a theory this bold comes on the scene.
Yeah. And, given that, we're all like philosophy nerds here,
Yes.
I'm really eager to dissect these arguments. Where do we even begin?
Well, I think there are two figures that really loom large
Okay.
in this critical response to the theory. And that's Saul Kripke
Okay.
and David Chalmers.
Okay.
Both of them are really raising profound questions about subjective experience and its relationship to the physical world, even though they come at it from very different angles.
Okay, so let's start with Kripke. What was his main line of attack?
Right. So Kripke's argument really revolves around this notion of rigid designators.
Okay.
It's a bit technical, but basically the gist is this.
Okay.
A rigid designator is a term that refers to the same thing
Okay.
across all possible worlds.
Okay.
So, for example,
Yep.
water always means H2O,
Okay.
no matter what.
Yeah, so even if we imagine a world where the rivers are filled with some other liquid,
Yeah.
we wouldn't call that water.
Exactly.
Okay, got it.
Now, what Kripke says is if pain is identical to a certain brain state,
Okay.
then pain should also be a rigid designator.
Okay.
Meaning, if that brain state exists, it should be experienced as pain.
So we couldn't have a world where that brain state occurs, but there's no feeling of pain.
That seems counterintuitive. Couldn't we imagine a world where, the brain activity's happening, but that subjective feeling is absent?
And that's precisely Kripke's point.
Okay.
He's arguing that the seemingly contingent link
Right.
between mental state and brain state
Yeah.
is just an illusion.
Okay.
Because if they're truly identical, you can't pull them apart.
Okay, that's a tough one to counter.
Yeah.
How do defenders of the identity theory kind of respond to that?
Well, remember we were talking earlier about consciousness as a kind of higher order perception?
Right. So one way to respond to this is to say, look, the brain state itself could exist
Okay.
without it being consciously perceived.
So it's like my brain registers a toothache,
Yeah,
but if that information doesn't kind of make it up to the, to the control room,
exactly.
then I don't actually experience it.
Yeah, it's like it's there,
Okay.
but it's not being broadcasted to the conscious self.
Okay.
So it's that higher order perception, that brain's awareness of its own state.
Okay.
That's maybe what's missing in Kripke's scenario.
Okay, that's a pretty clever way of getting around that issue.
Yeah.
So what about Chalmers then? I mean, he's practically synonymous with the hard problem of consciousness.
Exactly. Chalmers is all about those qualia, right? Those raw feels, those subjective qualities.
Right. It's not just that I see red.
Yeah.
It's what its likeness of seeing red.
Exactly. Yeah.
And he's saying no matter how well we map the brain, that's something that we'll just never be able to fully capture.
That's the essence of his argument.
Okay.
And he's very famous, of course, for this thought experiment, the philosophical zombie.
Right. Those philosophical zombies.
Yeah. So imagine a being that's physically identical to us, but without consciousness,
Okay.
without qualia.
Yeah, those thought experiments always kind of creep me out a little bit, but
Yeah.
I see the point. If they're physically identical, then how would we ever know?
Exactly.
How would we know if they weren't experiencing the world the same way?
Exactly. And that's how he's highlighting what he calls the hard problem, right?
Yeah.
explaining how these physical processes give rise to subjective experience.
So is he saying that consciousness is like some kind of soul or like a non-physical essence?
Not quite. He calls his view naturalistic dualism.
Naturalistic dualism. Okay.
Right, so it's kind of a middle ground.
Okay.
He's proposing that qualia are non-physical properties,
Okay.
but not supernatural.
Okay.
So they might be fundamental, like mass or charge, right?
Okay.
Okay. And that they interact with physical systems, including brains.
So not ghosts in the machine, but like something else entirely that we just don't really have a good grasp on yet.
Yeah, exactly. But then that raises this question, right?
Yeah.
If they're non-physical, how do we become aware of them?
Right.
We were talking before about consciousness as the brain sensing its own states.
Right. But how do we sense something that's non-physical?
Yeah, that's a huge issue. And so
Yeah.
Chalmers introduces what he calls the principle of coherence.
Okay.
And this principle basically says that there's this very tight relationship between brain processes and the sequence of conscious experiences.
So even if we don't quite understand like the exact connection,
Yeah,
they kind of run parallel to each other.
exactly.
Yeah.
But whether that really explains how we access these non-physical qualia
Yeah.
is a matter of ongoing debate.
It sounds like we've gone pretty far down the rabbit hole here. Have we like lost sight of the big picture?
Not at all. I think this exploration has been crucial because what we're seeing is that the mind-brain identity theory, while it offers this very powerful
Yeah.
and refreshingly straightforward explanation for the mind,
Yeah.
it also faces these really tough challenges when it comes to consciousness.
Yeah. No, I'm struck by how, you know, even just like engaging with this theory really forces us to confront what we even mean by like subjective experience.
Yeah.
You know, like if it is just brain activity, like how do we account for what it feels like to experience the world?
Exactly. And I think that gets to the heart of why philosophy of mind is so captivating, right? We're
Yeah.
trying to grasp at the nature of our own being,
Yeah.
our connection to the world, and
Yeah.
ultimately what it means to be human.
Deep stuff.
Yeah.
So where do we go from here? Like, what are some of the implications of like this theory for how we see ourselves, how we see the world?
Well, one of the big implications is that it really undermines the traditional mind-body split.
Okay.
You know, if mental states are brain states,
Yeah.
then our thoughts, our feelings, our sensations
Yeah.
are not separate from the physical world,
Right.
but embedded in it.
So we're not some ethereal soul like piloting a meat suit.
Not according to the identity theory.
Okay.
We are embodied beings.
Yeah.
Our minds are inseparable
Right.
from the physical stuff that makes us who we are.
I mean, that has massive implications for how we think about like personal identity, free will, morality,
Absolutely.
like all the big stuff.
All the big questions, yeah. Another thing I think is really important is that it changes how we study the mind,
Okay.
right? If mental states are brain states,
Yeah.
then neuroscience becomes essential
Okay.
for understanding the mind.
So philosophy and science need to really team up
Exactly.
to tackle these questions.
Exactly.
Wait,
We
yeah.
need philosophers to define the concepts, analyze the arguments, wrestle with these big questions,
Right.
and we need the scientists to explore the brain,
Yeah.
provide that empirical grounding.
So it's like a truly collaborative effort.
Precisely. Yeah.
It's amazing how a philosophical theory, like even one that's been, you know, heavily debated and critiqued,
Yeah.
can have such a like a ripple effect, right?
Yeah.
It's shaped not only how we think about the mind, but also how we study it,
Exactly.
which I think is that's amazing.
And it's really paving the way for you know, new discoveries and new ways of thinking about ourselves.
But before we move on, I'm kind of curious about one more thing. Like Chalmers' view,
Yeah.
while it's intriguing,
Yeah.
it paints a pretty mysterious picture of the universe, right?
Yeah.
With these like non-physical qualia, like interacting with physics.
It's a lot to process.
Yeah, it is.
But I think it leads to some pretty radical implications.
Okay.
If qualia are like fundamental to the universe,
Yeah.
could consciousness be a lot more widespread than we typically think?
Are you talking about like panpsychism?
Precisely.
Like that everything has some level of consciousness?
Yeah, Chalmers himself actually kind of flirts with this idea
Right.
that even like a thermostat
Right.
might have some kind of like rudimentary proto-qualia.
Okay.
And so if that's the case, then consciousness might be woven into the very fabric of reality.
So like trees, rocks, stars.
Yeah.
They're all like experiencing the world in their own way.
It's a possibility that some philosophers are taking very seriously.
Wow, that's
Yeah, it
right.
raises
Thrill.
it raises a whole other set of questions about what these different forms of consciousness would be like
Yeah.
and how they interact with the physical world.
I think that's a deep dive for another day.
Yes, definitely.
But it's amazing how even just like exploring this one theory, the mind-brain identity theory, has opened up all of these like vast and kind of mind-boggling possibilities.
Absolutely. And that's the beauty of philosophy, right?
Yeah.
It's challenging our assumptions, it's expanding our horizons,
Yeah.
and it's really making us contemplate the mysteries of existence. But I think we should shift gears now
Okay.
and explore like the lasting legacy of the identity theory.
Right.
How has it really shaped the landscape of philosophy of mind?
Yeah, that's a great question.
And I think that'll be a story for our final segment.
All right. So we've journeyed through like all the big ideas of the mind-brain identity theory.
Yeah.
We've wrestled with some of its biggest criticisms,
We have.
and we've even gotten a glimpse of like the really mind-boggling implications
Yeah.
for our understanding of consciousness.
It can get pretty out there
Yeah.
pretty quickly.
But now I think it's time to reflect on like the theory's legacy,
Yes, I agree.
because even with all the debate it sparked,
Yeah.
there's no denying that's had a huge impact on philosophy of mind. So how has this theory, even with its critics, like shaped the way that we think about the mind today?
Well, I think one of the biggest shifts it brought about was this real push for greater precision and rigor when we're talking about mental states. You know,
Yeah.
thinkers like Place and Smart,
Yeah.
they were determined to like ground mental concepts in something tangible, something observable,
Right.
those brain processes.
So before the identity theory came along,
Yeah.
were discussions about the mind a bit more, I don't know, like nebulous?
I think in some ways, yes.
Okay.
You know, there was a lot of talk about the mind as this separate,
Okay.
non-physical entity.
Yeah.
And while there were certainly sophisticated theories out there about how the mind and body interacted,
Yeah.
I think they often relied on like more vague
Yeah.
or metaphorical language.
So the identity theory was like, hey, if we want to really talk about the mind, we got to like get down to the nitty-gritty of the brain.
Exactly. It was a call for clarity, for a more scientific approach to studying the mind.
Yeah.
And even though the identity theory itself has faced, you know, some challenges,
Yeah.
I think that call for clarity has really resonated throughout the field.
So even if we don't like totally embrace all of the claims of the identity theory, it's kind of pushed us to ask more precise questions
Yes,
and look for more rigorous answers.
absolutely. It spurred philosophers to really grapple with these concepts like consciousness,
Yeah.
subjectivity, qualia,
Yeah.
in ways that could connect with, you know, scientific discoveries
Right.
rather than just sort of speculating from afar.
It's like the identity theory built a bridge between philosophy and neuroscience,
Yeah.
even if that bridge is still kind of like under construction.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
It's led to this more like unified understanding of the mind.
I think so. And we're seeing more and more collaboration
Yeah.
between philosophers and scientists,
Yeah.
leading to fresh insights, new avenues of research.
Yeah. It's amazing how a philosophical theory, like even one that's been, you know, so heavily debated,
Yeah.
can have like this ripple effect,
Yeah.
right? It's shaped not only how we think about the mind, but also how we study it.
Absolutely.
And it's really like paving the way for new discoveries, which is pretty incredible.
I think so too.
So for our listener who's been with us on this, like deep dive into the mind-brain identity theory,
Yeah.
what's the key takeaway?
Well, I think the central message here is that the nature of the mind,
Okay.
especially consciousness,
Yeah.
remains one of the deepest,
Yeah.
most challenging mysteries we face.
No doubt.
And the identity theory, while not without its flaws,
Yeah.
offers this compelling framework
Right.
for understanding the mind
Yeah.
as grounded in the physical reality of the brain.
Right.
But the conversation is far from over.
Yeah.
Exploring these questions,
Yeah.
grappling with the challenges, pushing the boundaries of our understanding, that's what makes philosophy of mind such a captivating
It really is.
and endlessly fascinating field.
It's a good reminder that the quest for knowledge is a journey, not a destination. Even when we think we've reached an answer,
Exactly.
there's always like new horizons to explore.
And who knows what incredible discoveries await us
Right.
as we continue to delve into the mysteries of the mind.
This has been an incredible deep dive.
It has.
Until next time,
Yeah.
keep exploring and never stop questioning.
Great advice.